Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, when you're making a two-part, more or less feature movie that's made almost entirely from pre-existing footage, having some skills as an editor kind of pays off. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you're in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast, where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of entertainment industry professionals and we pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more, in a light and in a conversational fashion. And if you like how we do things around here, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you do, because let's face it, you're listening right now. And if you are listening, please keep listening. And subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. Gives you a 5-star rating on your podcast provider of choice. We're available pretty much everywhere, places like Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google. And plus, we archive every single one of our episodes over at our In the Seats YouTube channel, so if you can give us a like and subscribe there as well, we would absolutely appreciate it. Also, don't hesitate to check us out on social media. We're on the Facebook, the Twitter, the Instagram, the Letterboxd, the TikTok, well, hell, and probably a few other places too that I've forgotten about. Threads. Yeah, Threads. I think we're on Threads. But at In the Seats for all sorts of fun updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, please pay us a visit over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, for all the latest and greatest from the world of film, television, basically the moving image at large. Because guess what? If we love to watch it and write about it and talk about it, we love it that much more when you come by and read about it and listen about it. So please do us that kindness, come by and pay us a visit. You know, it's one of those things when you're pulling from pre-existing material that you need to not only maintain the source material, but you need to make sure things still stay snappy and kind of on point to the story that you're trying to tell. But it's one of those things that it's a lost art. It's not a lost art, but people don't appreciate the art of editing, and it's something that comes up really beautifully in the Steve Martin documentary, which is on Apple TV Plus right now. It's in 2 parts, and it's really an excellent piece of work, and it really gives us a fantastic overview on the life of Steve! Martin, which, like I said, is on Apple TV Plus now. And we had the unique pleasure of sitting down with Emmy nominee Alan Lowe just to talk about getting the job, the art of editing, sort of the challenges therein when you're digging through so much archival material and so very much more. And it's just, again, it really is interesting to see just, especially like I said, when you're going off of pre-existing material, how you have to not only maintain the spirit of the original stuff, but also keep it in line with the story. And these guys really do an excellent job. And if you love Steve Martin, or if you just love pop culture, this is a fascinating piece that I can't wait for more and more people to see. But again, it is nominated for a bunch of stuff, including Best Editing. But go check it out on Apple TV Plus. But first, enjoy our talk with Alan Lowe, because between you and me, it's a pretty darn good one. I mean, obviously, Alan, just first off, I just want to say thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate this. And I mean, congrats on the nomination and your work on the Steve Martin documentary.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Now, I mean, I'm always curious, like I always like to know how people sort of get into, finding, getting offered a job or getting, brought into a project like this. But especially when you're dealing with so much archival footage, it feels like the role of the editor kind of takes on a different beast. Can you walk me through, I guess, the early stages of not just how Morgan wanted this structured, but how I can imagine the work changes a little bit when you're having to dig through these archives of stuff as well to sort of put it all together properly.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, Morgan has a really good turn phrase that in scripted, you write the movie and then you go and shoot it. But in documentary, you shoot the movie and then you go and write it. Which, for something like this, it's like the story, it's all there. So it's really just like, which pieces of the story are you putting together to create the portrait of Steve that you want to create? Because he's such a monumental figure, and he's so just so deep. And what really helped in this case is he has a book that he wrote about 20 years ago. It was called Born Standing Up.
Yeah.
And he really laid out all of his thoughts about this period of time that the first film covers. And so it really helped then when we went back and were interviewing him. Um, he was very like the memories were still fresh. Sometimes you'll find that you go back and you interview people and you have to really like dig to like get them to remember, what happened. And then, eventually it'll come out. But with him, it was really nice just because he was so like uh, you know, he's so eloquent to begin with, but then he had already put a lot of thought into this stuff, so that helped a lot. But it's still, the kind of process was that Morgan and Steve sat down for probably 12, 15 hours of interviews,
Hmm.
just about everything and all over the place. And then we kind of took that and from there, like we pulled out the kind of backbone of the movie. And so then a lot of it is becomes like this kind of juggling act of like, well, Steve tells this really great story, but we have no footage for it, or we have this really great footage, but Steve didn't really want to talk about it. It's like, so you know how do you combine things? How do you like amplify some stories? How do you find like deeper meaning in other stories? It's a really kind of, like I said, it's kind of like you have the movies in front of you, the 15 hours of interviews, the 50 hours of archive, the 1,000 stills, and then you're like, okay, well, how do we write this movie out of that? Um,
I can imagine, yeah. It's really an interesting this thing to just see how it evolved, and I mean just to see how Morgan wanted to do this because I mean you only worked on sort of the first one, am I correct?
that's right, yeah.
So
And I have a funny story about that, but
please tell, please.
so I worked on the first one, and then another editor, Jeff Malmberg, cut the second one. And Morgan was very clear that he didn't want me and Jeff talking about the film to each other. So what's interesting about that, though, is that Jeff and I are good friends, and we had just cut a film together before this one. And Jeff was a co-director on that film. So we worked very, very closely together. And then Morgan one day is like, okay, don't talk to him. And we're in the same office. So he's just down the hall. And it became this kind of like, this like cone of silence, and Morgan was the intermediary, where it was like, if I had a scene, he was like, you know what, don't I see where you're going with this, but don't go there. We're going to do that in part two. It's like so he was able to mediate it a little bit. But he really wanted the two films to reflect the two different kind of personas of Steve, because he really got to this point where he was in his late 30s and the biggest comedian in the world, after having grinded through the comedy circuit for since he was 10, really. So for 20 years he'd been struggling and struggling and struggling, and finally he hit, and was selling out stadiums before any comedian had ever done that before. And you see this footage, and now it kind of, there are other comedians who sell out stadiums now, but at the time that was so unusual and just so unique for a comedian to be that famous. And he gets to a point where he says, I don't want to do this anymore. This is not, I achieved my goal, but I realized that's not it. It doesn't fill the hole that I have in my life. And it's such a strange like thing that he stopped doing it. I think because it was so long ago, people kind of forget, but it's almost as if like when the Beatles break up, like John and Paul do something else, like they become
Yeah,
actors
yeah, yeah.
and never make music ever again. Um, it's just so strange that he stopped doing the thing that everyone knew him for doing. But anyway, he made such like an about face, both professionally and personally, that Morgan wanted the two films to feel, you wanted to feel that moment. And I think actually, it's a bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen the two films, but we like to talk about that the our favorite cut is actually the first shot of part two. So like part one ends and you're expecting part two to start in that same way. And then part two is completely different.
Yeah.
First shot of you see, Steve today walk through the door. And you're like, whoa, this is it's such a it's such a pulling the rug out kind of moment that and so, that was kind of Morgan's goal from the beginning. And so it's like keep me and Jeff separate so that there's like very little other than Steve himself, there's very little connection between the two films.
Was it always Morgan's plan to sort of have these as sort of two separate films in sort of this one series? Because I mean, again, like you said, there is this real tonal shift to it. And I mean, I love your Beatles analogy because it really does almost feel like, at the end of part one, it's like, okay, here's the wings.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was always the plan. Not, from day one, he was given some runway to kind of gather archive and scope out the film before he even decided it would be two films. Like so he had a few months to really kind of think about what he wanted to do, which is really great because sometimes you get a call um more so as an editor, less so as a director, but you'll get a call and it'll be like, can you start next week? And you have to like put yourself in the mindset like quickly. But he had a lot of time, and I think it shows that to be able to really come up with something fun and high concept, that's really special for someone like Steve, who's not, just like your average person. Like he deserved like a unique take.
Was all of this done in concert, like, or were there situations of like if you had done it all chronologically, like was there a situation where oh God, Steve just said something we're using for part two, which is going to affect something we did in part one. You've got to go back and fix this, or was it all kind of happening in one big melting pot?
It was all happening in one big melting pot, but I think because of how drastic the change in Steve's life was,
Hmm.
we actually at the end of the day when we sat down and watched, Morgan was obviously watching both films, so he knew like if there was going to be overlap that there would be a problem. But when we sat down and watched it, there were only a handful of things that were overlapping, and mostly to do with Steve's father because he's a character in both films.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was kind of, we had to, after the fact, kind of do a little bit of surgery on like making sure that the arc like started in part one and paid off in part two. Like there were some things I was doing at the end of part one to really pay off and kind of end that, not end, but like have it feel like a complete arc. And we, realized that it's like, oh no, actually then in part two, you know too much, so we had to save some of that for part two. And then same thing with like that we had a scene about Bernadette Peters in part one, and then we realized that actually it's made more sense to deal with her in part two, and just his relationships because he's such a solitary figure in part one.
Totally. Totally.
So things like that, eventually we had to kind of reconcile. But yeah, I think just because it really showed how it was such a strong connection to the character, the concept that it kind of worked in the end.
No, I'm curious, like ultimately for you in the job, sort of in editing in the editorial department, like where does the creative payoff come? Because I can imagine on jobs like this, especially when you're dealing with sort of like, someone you admire and all this sort of older archival stuff, you've got a little bit more rope to sort of do things and try things. Whereas if you're working on sort of a comedy TV show, it's like, no, hit this beat, hit this beat, hit this beat, and then get out because we got to do the next one.
Yeah, it's funny, I always it's yeah, the creative payoff, it's funny because it's like there's such an elation when you like get a job. You're
Mm.
like, I'm gonna knock this out of the park. And then the first day of the job, it becomes stressful and terrifying. Um, but I think with this kind of projects, which I've been a Steve Martin fan since I was you know I had a VHS of Sergeant Bilko when I was a,
Yeah.
a kid, and I had the Wild and Crazy Guy concert special in high school. It's just like I've always been a fan, but it's the kind of thing where you don't want to get in the way of the subject, and it's actually a really difficult challenge because the impulse can be to create, especially in what's supposed to be comedy create jokes that are coming from the edit. Uh, but we found that, and there's a couple here and there in here, but we found that really it's like Steve should be driving the comedy, and you really want to create like a narrative where he's not immediately fully formed. Um, so that at the beginning of the movie, he's not terrible, but he shouldn't be as, killer as he is at the end
Right.
when he's full, like his comic voice is like completely developed. And so really like for me, the kind of satisfaction came from like when we finally had a full rough cut and you could feel that progression. Because it's hard. Like there were times when Morgan and I early in the process were like, oh, is Steve ever going to be funny? Like when with some of these early shows where he is really struggling. Um, but then when you get to the end of the film and he's just, you know, so on, feeling that like, especially, and I think anyone in creative endeavor can identify with it because he just like focused and grinded and worked and worked and worked and worked, and then it paid off for him, both like professionally paid off where he was successful, and also like you could really feel the growth, um so I feel like that to me is like the big, and that's been for most projects I've cut, where it's like once you have that first cut and you're like, okay, the kind of train of the story, it works. That's really the big payoff.
Would it be? I mean, this might be part and parcel just due to the time period of when Steve came up, but in watching this, it felt like not just this film, but I mean, you could even apply this to maybe other documentaries about other famous comedians and sort of pop culture people like Steve, that it follows very much a train of thought like the Rock documentary.
Yeah.
You want to be very true to the artist and sort of their struggles and coming in, but at the same time, you can't edit the beat. When they find their moment, when they find the right bit, it's like, you can't cut Steve doing Wild Crazy Guy, you can't cut Bonham's drum solo, you can't, you've got to find that right rhythm to sort of, once he hits the magic, you've got to let the magic play out.
Yeah, exactly. We actually talked a lot about how this is basically a music film. And I think you're right. It's the bits are kind of like songs, and it was really a challenge because a lot of Steve's early comedy was so non sequitur based. So
Yeah.
you did have to kind of like, all right, it's not, but that in a way, like thinking about it, like music helped because it became less about um as if it were a song. It became less about the lyrics, although they're important, and it became more about the feeling, and more about the kind of the rhythm of it and so sometimes like yeah, like a joke might not be related to where we are in the narrative, but if if it felt like rhythmically it fit in, and it felt like tonally it fit in, then I think there's some jokes like that yeah, if you really drill down, it's like it's the joke is like unrelated, but it works because it feels like you're again like on that journey with him.
It almost felt like jazz too. It's like it's one of those things where it may not make sense in the moment, but there's going to be a payoff later if you're really sort of appreciating it all as a whole. So
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we kind of did that sometimes. We had a joke that he would kind of set up, and like there's a joke in the boarding house where he is talking about how he fills the balloons with words so that when they pop they go, damn it. And then if you keep playing that, a lot of times the balloon would pop and he'd say it. But in that scene we don't do it, and then in a scene 10 minutes later it pops and he says it, or there's another scene where he's saying something like, oh, boy, it's great to be here. Actually, it's great to be here. And then he'd step to the side.
yeah,
And then later we come in, late on the joke. He's like, boy, wasn't it great to be over there? And so it's the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, you want to, yeah, it's like, yeah, it's like jazz, sometimes it's like the melody line, you'll hear it later and you'll be like, there it is, uh, so
No, I mean, walk me through, I guess, getting the call that he got nominated, because I can imagine, I mean, this is probably a first timer for you, right? I can imagine
It is,
you would have
yeah.
had a bit of a moment where you looked behind you and went, "No, you're talking to me." What?
Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, it was like my son who's 3, his nanny was sick that day. So I was home from work and uh I started getting all these texts and I, wasn't paying attention. And then, like looked down and, was they were like rolling in. But it was funny because then my son was like, no, no, pay attention to me. Like what, like where are we going to the playground? So it was like I had to really turn off from it and like wait until his nap time before I could like really celebrate. It's pretty funny.
No, I mean, I'm curious. This is almost a nerd-like question to ask, but I've never known. Like, when the nomination like this happens, I mean, do you get to go to the big show, or do you go to sort of the technical award show? Like, I've never understood sort of the delineation of like how much of the actual team gets to show up to the big show.
So they do it over 2 weekends.
Yeah,
I actually went, I worked on the George Harrison documentary, Living the Material World.
right.
That was 12 years ago. And so we won Best Documentary that year. And so the whole team gets to go, and which is great, to celebrate. And they do it where um, across 2 weekends, and uh, there's the one big night that's broadcast.
Right.
They shoot all the other nights. And like, for example, the night that George Harrison won, they were also doing like best supporting actor, in
Right.
a like what like a big scripted category.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they just cut those into the broadcast. So but it's nice because, it's like if they had all the categories together in one room in one space, then they have to like speed through everything. But the documentary community is smaller than the scripted community. So it's nice because then everyone in nonfiction is there together in one time. And so you see people, and it's a lot of fun. But yeah, so and then for example, when George Harrison won, they played that in the broadcast as well. So
Oh, nice.
they do kind of mix and match, and so yeah, it's fun. Yeah, it's definitely it's nice because it's a nice like cathartic celebration for everyone, I think.
How has, I mean, I guess even from a behind the scenes standpoint, how has the doc community evolved, especially in terms of how things are presented? Because, I mean, at least for me, from my perspective as a viewer, it feels like, you know, 10, 15 years ago, people would, think of the documentary as sort of the talking head and then the facts and then the talking head and so on and so forth. But also, it feels like there's more room to play. There's not necessarily as many rules in
Yeah.
documentary as there are in sort of straight narrative. I mean, I think of the old joke of Hitchcock only shooting exactly what he needed for the film, so his editors couldn't fuck it up.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's what I really love about the form is that you, it's like you said, there's a lot more leeway for storytelling,
Hmm.
not devices, but like you for just like creativity in a way, scripted is it's like everything is so cautious because it's such a big apparatus, and you have to like get it on the day or else, and documentary, it's like you really can um like it's really like a journey of like finding something, and the film like finds itself, and that happens like across the whole process, where it's like I feel like a lot of times with in scripted, it's like you kind of know from the screenplay and like from those early conversations, those early days, like this is what the movie is going to be, and then it
Yeah.
becomes that. Whereas yeah, a lot of documentaries, like you don't know that. You don't know what the movie's really going to look like. And that's kind of
Like
part of the
Morgan
fun
said,
of it.
he hasn't written it yet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of part of the creative challenge in a really satisfying way, And I think it's like I think it's telling that you see a lot of like big scripted directors also make documentaries on the side because it's like a break for them, that they get to kind of do whatever they want. Um so yeah, it's I really enjoy it. especially as an editor, because it really is like, you have, it's a different challenge. Like I've cut scripted before and it's, equally challenging, but just in a different way, and yeah, you get to, like I said, it's like you get to take bigger swings in documentary, I think.
Well, I think you're right, man. But I mean, honestly, just thank you so much for being a part of this. Because I mean, I just particularly in this first part, I mean, I knew the Wild and Crazy Guy. I appreciated the Wild and Crazy Guy, but I never quite understood how big of a moment it was, sort of culturally, him being this guy and then walking away from it. And I really got a sense of that in this first part. And I mean, I thought it was really beautifully well done. I think y'all did a great job. But I mean, just
Thank you.
congrats on the nomination and congrats on the work. And I mean, obviously, thank you so much again for the time. I
Yeah,
really
of course.
appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
All
Yeah.
right. And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.